Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Amir Pasek. I am Dean of the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Welcome to the 17th Annual Thomas H. Lake Lecture. The Lake Lecture is a highlight of our academic year. It draws attention to the exceptional work in the field that is nurtured by the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. It is a highlight that we have sorely missed. Thank you for waiting for the past 2 years for us to reconvene. A big thank you to our speakers, David Brooks and Ann Snyder, for hanging in there with us. And a big thank you to the Lake Institute community gathered here in person and online as well. This is an important moment for us to reconnect, and this promises to be an important evening of reflection and conversation about the value of connecting. But first, to offer our official welcome, it is my great pleasure to introduce IUPUI's Interim Chancellor, Andy Klein. Former Dean of the IU McKinney Law School, Interim Chancellor Klein has been a member of the IUPUI faculty for 22 years. He has served in a number of key leadership roles on our campus, including as Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and Chief of Staff to the then Chancellor, Charles Bantz. He is currently the Paul E. Beam Professor of Law, and he is an award-winning teacher, an active scholar, and an expert on tort law and environmental law. He is also a great friend and champion of the Lilly Family School and the Lake Institute. We truly appreciate his service to our campus as he provides a steady hand and instills a can-do spirit in these times of transition. Please join me in welcoming Interim Chancellor of IUPUI, Andy Klein.
Thank you so much, Amir. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you this evening. It's so nice to have events like this once again, and to welcome David Brooks and Ann Snyder as tonight's special speakers for the Thomas H. Lake Lecture. So I want to welcome all of you in person. Amir told me we have a lot of people I should welcome virtually as well. As you know, tonight's lecture honors Tom Lake, who was the chair of the Lilly Endowment's board for many years. Tom and Marjorie Lake's passion for faith and for giving was the inspiration that their daughter Karen Lake Buttrey, son-in-law Don Buttrey, and the endowment built upon in establishing the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. I'm pleased that members of the Buttrey family could join us both in person and virtually tonight. We have a number of other special guests with us tonight that I'd like to briefly recognize. It's been a pleasure to see so many friends from the Lilly Endowment here tonight. Clay Robbins sitting in the second row, the president and CEO. Clay, thank you for supporting this event and being here with us this evening. I'm also delighted that the first full-time director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving and Lilly Endowment board member, Bill Enright, is here with his wife Edie and members of their family. I saw Bill and Edie over on this side right here earlier this evening. Thank you for being here, and I appreciate all of your continuous support. Finally, I do want to thank members of the Lake Institute's advisory board and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy's Board of Visitors for your dedication, commitment, and support. In fact, if any members of those boards are here and could stand, I'd like to acknowledge them with a round of applause. So if you're a member of the board, please stand and we'll recognize your service. Although it is the newest school on campus, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy has very deep roots at IUPUI. Philanthropy as an academic discipline was born more than 3 decades ago here in Indianapolis. And our faculty have been integral in developing and refining the discipline, and people around the world are paying attention. We're proud that the first school of philanthropy in the world is helping us all appreciate how generosity builds the world we share. What began as a bold experiment in higher education has become home to a vibrant community of scholars, students, and practitioners. I should note, I told Amir I'd go a little off script. I have personal fondness for the Lilly School of Philanthropy. I was the chair of the search committee that led to the hiring of Dean Pasek, and anyone who knows Dean Pasek knows that was a really outstanding choice. How about one more round of applause for Dean Pasek? The Lake Institute has played a pivotal role in the growth and contributions of the school over the years, as it seeks to foster a deeper understanding of the dynamic relationship between faith and giving. The Lake Lecture is one of the important ways we engage the local community at this intersection through thoughtful public conversation. The conversation this evening about the interplay among faith, philanthropy, and community, comes at a really important time. As a country, we've seen how national and international events can either bring us together or tear us apart. At this very moment, we're facing major questions about global health, about peace around the world, about economic stability. We're asking questions about the meaning of character, leadership, service, and belief. These issues and questions speak to the importance of community and the difference it can make in people's lives. On our campus, at IUPUI, we're growing and building a community as we work to create the most inclusive and diverse campus possible. With nearly 28,000 students enrolled last fall, we're home to an entering class 40% of whom are students of color. We count among our students more than 1,500 international students from 142 different countries. Everything we do on campus is focused on preparing this large and diverse group of people to be active, engaged, and successful members of society. Now, David Brooks and Ann Snyder will be introduced more fully in just a moment, but in closing, just let me say once again how pleased we are that we could have both of you here joining us this evening to deliver the 2022 Lake Lecture. I very much look forward to the conversations, and I thank all of you for joining this very important dialogue. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Interim Chancellor Klein, and I hope you don't regret your choice of a dean for the Lilly School yet. So allow me to echo Andy's thanks to the Lilly Endowment and the National Bank of Indianapolis for supporting this event, and also thanks to St. Luke's United Methodist Church for hosting us in this welcoming space. This is the largest gathering in the short history of the Lake Institute and the Lilly School family as well, as it includes our friends online who are watching us as well. But more than size, the Thomas Lake Lecture is an important moment of punctuation in the regular rhythms of our work and study. In the 7 years that I've had the privilege of my current role, the Lake Lecture has always reflected something vital about the moment in which we find ourselves, be it the interfaith dynamic, engaging the spiritual yearning of our youth, the true meaning of money, or understanding how the science of generosity points us beyond transactions. As we gather again after much too long, it is wonderfully appropriate that our distinguished speakers this evening will be addressing how to make meaningful connections with others. Many in our school's community share with our speakers and the growing community of weavers and groundbreakers the conviction that there is some important work to be done where spirituality and generosity encounter each other in community. So, as we welcome David Brooks and Ann Snyder to the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, I am very gratified that questions of religion and ethics are integral to what the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy is about. Our gathering this evening would not have been possible, as the Chancellor said, without the example of Tom and Marjorie Lake and the philanthropic kindness offered to us in their honor by Karen Lake Buttry and Donald Buttry. The Lake and Buttry families have helped instill a legacy of thoughtful consideration about faith and giving in what I hope is now deeply embedded in our cultural DNA. As the Lake Institute's Advisory Council well knows, it is their spirit of dedicated fellowship that we try to emulate as we nurture our school's community. And now to our speakers this evening. David Brooks is a columnist for the New York Times, a role he started in 2003. He is also a commentator on PBS NewsHour and NPR's All Things Considered. He's the author of several best-selling books, the latest two being The Road to Character, published in 2015, and The Second Mountain, The Quest for Moral Life, that came out in 2019. He also teaches at Yale and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Tonight, you will hear more about his role as founder and chair of The Weave, the social fabric project at the Aspen Institute. And Snyder is the editor-in-chief of Comment magazine and oversees its partner project, Breaking Ground. She is the host of the Whole Person Revolution podcast and co-editor of Breaking Ground, Charting Our Future in a Pandemic Year, which was published in 2022, and copies of which I see floating around the audience already. It is a collective memoir of the pandemic years, gathering the voices of a number of compelling figures as they cast their vision toward the renewal of civilization. Prior to Comment, she directed the Philanthropy Roundtable's Character Initiative, a program seeking to help foundations and business leaders strengthen the quote-unquote middle ring of morally formative institutions. Her path-breaking guidebook, The Fabric of Character, A Wise Giver's Guide to Renewing Our Social and Moral Landscape, was published in 2019. She has also published widely, including in the Atlantic Monthly, the Washington Post, Bittersweet Monthly, and of course, Comment. We will proceed with David and Ann speaking about their work, after which they will join in conversation with our very own Melissa Spass, Interim Director of the Lake Institute, and Professor Una Osili, our Ephraimson Chair and Associate Dean. Please join me in welcoming David and Ann to our community.
Thank you. It's truly humbling to be here. So I don't know about you, but I feel a little bit like the world's on fire these days. Ukraine is being destroyed, and there's threat of a larger war, possibly even world-ending nuclear war. COVID still lurks in the background. Many of us are stressed by a verbal and ultimately political minefield of signaling faux pas when trying to dig into deep-seated pain points in our common life. Violent rhetoric is blowing from the fringe more to the mainstream. Anxiety is at record highs. Racist acts are on the rebound. Friendships continue to erode due to lack of attention and just sort of the long tail of social distancing. The calamitous effects of climate change are careening our way, and those actors that might help our world address it can't seem to unify sufficient political consensus. And honestly, just about everyone I know is confessing a severe depletion in emotional and mental bandwidth. We just can't do or feel or serve any more than is already being put upon us. We are, whether stay-at-home mom or college president or nurse or pastor or flight attendant or Will Smith, apparently, we're just spent. And we are spent in part because there is no longer any buffer between our day-to-day duties and the forces rumbling our world. The zeitgeist of troubled times has snuck into our homes and our relationships, our work and our sleep. What was private is now public, and what is public doesn't seem to know any peace. There was an article that went viral earlier this year in the New York Times titled, "The 37-year-olds are afraid of the 23-year-olds who work for them." And it caught my eye too. And there was a quote from an entrepreneur, a co-founder of a company called Plant People, I guess a certified B Corporation, and the founder said to the reporter, Emma Goldberg, he said, "You know, you talk to older people and they're like, dude, we sell tomato sauce. We don't sell politics." The entrepreneur then continued to say, "Then I have younger people coming into my company and they are saying, no, these are political tomatoes. This is political tomato sauce." It's not just young people that are blurring the lines of what has historically been expressed where. College faculty increasingly understand their vocational roles to be advocates of a particular cause rather than as seekers of understanding. Debates around critical theory have spilled into the public domain when the tools for using it productively, helpfully, are known really only by a trained few. When people ask, "What church do you attend?" sometimes it seems more often loaded with political suspicion than spiritual care. This last month, and here I'm torn right now, I don't quite know what to think, we've seen not just government-sanctioned Russia, we've seen private companies and cultural platforms do so, all while bobbing along to the ebbs and tides of public opinion. It just seems clear that we are all chafing against a poverty of choice when it comes to those vehicles that can channel our noblest moral longings. Worshiping beings, and I think we're all worshiping whether we know God or we don't, invariably pivot if we are left hungry at the altar, especially in a country like ours pervaded by a market logic of competitive options. Today, the fact that those spheres that have historically helped organize, if not catalyze, a propulsive moral witness, you think about the church's role in the civil rights movement in this country, government's role in expanding the vote to women and to people of color, journalism's role in exposing Watergate and other leadership and political scandals that would have compromised our democratic process, the role of science in discovering vaccines and medicines that can save lives and allow us to labor and commune together one more day. Just the fact that these various traditional spheres of expertise, of honed craft, and in the most existential of cases, of the blessing of covenant, binding people to a place and a community and a creed, are now all perceived somehow as either impotent or gauche, or perhaps more damaging, just suspect in their perceived allegiance within our ongoing culture wars around issues like race or rights or sexual and reproductive ethics or individual liberties. The reality of all this widespread distrust seems to me as much an indictment of their institutional embrace often of a utilitarian ethic over and above sort of a full-throated clarity around the common good they exist to serve, as it's also a reflection of our own fecklessness as human beings tricked into thinking we are actually only consumers and critics. For our institutions, of course, reflect us, and we can be shallow creatures. We get frustrated by the slow arc of justice, impatient for results, and eager for scapegoats to explain away our pain. So we choose the lowest hanging fruit, the platform that makes us feel righteous, the popular slogan, the quick condemnation. Nowhere was this more evident than the summer of 2020, with sort of relational, more covenantal means of reckoning, lament, acknowledgement of the particular to particulars, confession in the particulars to the particular, and then forgiveness, the possibility of forgiveness there, all robbed by the pandemic, and sort of years before that of simmering discontent. A lot of us took to the street in the wake of George Floyd's death. And for a joyous moment that May, there was a sense of unity between blacks and whites, believers in the sacred and defenders of the secular, even progressives and conservatives, a unity that felt like it was building on the human solidarity that the disease had been building. But that hope crumbled through lack of inspired leadership, perhaps, into excess and still deeper division. Forced into physical isolation for too long, we all just seemed to careen into magnified shadow. Years of intensifying political idolatry ruptured into in-group splintering and betrayal. Distrust of vested authority festered into conspiracy and new kind of totalist explanations as to what was really motivating what. The media sprinted to keep up with events and articulate their meaning, but most interpretations were weighted by partisan conviction and zero-sum moral narratives. We all just started to hate one another a little bit more. We all started to feel like we were going crazy. And as all this happened, as a local pharmacy down the street from David and me in DC began to burn that summer, and as I watched perverse and foreboding new divisions curl around even our sense of social safety and freedom along lines of race and ideological denomination, I found myself writing some desperate words at the top of a blank page. And they were these: Church, where are you? This question felt like part accusation, part anguish and lament, part exasperation, part plea, and also part soul-searching on my own commitment as I found myself as a Christian implicated in the invisibility or worse perversion of this typically grace-giving organ that should be resounding with truth and love. If the summer of 2020 and all that has happened since is yet one more sign we shouldn't have needed of a society that is not yet clear on what it is to be fully human, and seems daily to fail in sowing the conditions for more people to see one another as fully human, a society that remains unhealed from a founding error in recognition one to another, then where is the moral ecology that should be spiritually and philosophically equipped to embody a correction? I'm a part of several secular communities these days, including some catalyzed by Philanthropy, that are trying to do the anthropological work required to put to bed once and for all this country's false hierarchy of human value as it has manifested in key documents throughout our history and continues in practice and culture through this day, often sort of in the unconscious. Maybe David will follow me up here and persuade all of you that the sciences provide an answer to what a person is, that what we're learning these days about the brain provides an answer to what a person is. But years of experiencing secular troubleshooting of what is fundamentally a sin problem has just made me dubious that secular categories and secular philosophies are large enough and, frankly, pointed enough to hold the glory of our human longings that make us truly equal in God's sight and in our relations with one another. The only anthropology I've found that can satisfy the question, what is a person, who is the human, is one with a transcendent frame of reference. More specifically, and I guess I will just go on the record here as saying this, a Christian anthropology that says we're a people that belong to each other because we belong to God. An anthropology that acknowledges that we are creatures and therefore finite receivers, dependent vertically and interdependent horizontally, and that in this we are also gloriously endowed with an imprint of the divine, making us agents generated by grace when we choose to say yes to it, directed to design worlds within this world we were given on the map of what we have or haven't experienced of love. So I've just been asking these last few years, church, where are you in leading our flailing democracy in this vital, urgent, rehumanizing task? Where are the people of peace? I spend the bulk of my days now searching out an answer to this question, not in overwrought accusation, nor ecclesial navel-gazing or fix-it technique, nor, frankly, in the very present polarization of our pews throughout the country, but out on the street, an incarnate witness, almost always local, quite often on the periphery, looking for those who are unafraid yet graceful, looking for people with a clear lens on the scars of our history and our reality, but who always point that lens perseveringly and with intention towards hope. I find the answer in an African-American nun in rural Mississippi who has the clarity to say, quote, "We live in a time when the loud and the powerful try to make us less open to one another's gifts." I find the answer in places like the Other Side Academy, a life training school in Salt Lake City where reformed rascals, once chained to their crimes and addictions, have found through a community of peer-to-peer radical accountability a reason to be free and a process that transforms their moral compass over several years. I find the church I'm looking for in Shreveport, Louisiana, a city once riven by race and socioeconomic difference, now living this reincarnation of Jane Addams' settlement house movement through the catalytic presence of Community Renewal International, an organization as much as a neighborly logic that is cultivating a contagion of care that knows no damper on its creative breath, and whose founder, a 74-year-old former pastor, Mac McCarter, when he reflects back on the healing tapestry before his eyes now that has emerged in the city, he says with tears, "I'm just so grateful that somewhere along the way I didn't miss the kingdom of God. I could have so easily missed it." I find the answer in Justin Giboney and the AND campaign, which is daily surprising the prevailing political categories suffocating all of us, and empowering effective advocacy for justice and mercy to marry in very real challenges of police brutality and affordable housing, discriminatory zoning laws, and exclusionary politics. I find the answer in Nyack College, a university in Battery Park, New York City that draws its students from the hundreds of storefront churches that line the outer boroughs of Manhattan. a school whose body is made up of happens to be made up of 24% African American, 24% Asian, 24% Latino, 16% international, 11% white, and 1% indigenous students who choose not to express a fear that a romanticized Christian heritage is losing ground, but rather live into their stories of exile with humility, faith, and hospitality, radiating what the demands of a beloved community require, radiating that outward to one of the more powerful cities on earth. I find a sustained expression of it at Regent College, an educational institution that is finding and forming future Eugene Petersons and Walter Brueggemans, whose prophetic sight becomes a kind of glue and shared framework for the bridge builders and peacemakers, placemakers, and justice shakers to work together in appreciative tandem, not in competition. I find it in the Living Hope Wheelchair Association, a Houston-based community organization of immigrants paralyzed by spinal cord injuries who model a way of accompanying others through suffering, drafting the textbook of what our future of responding to natural disasters will require. I find it in the Bruderhof, an Anabaptist community whose members share all their possessions in common, taking the Beatitudes as literally as they can, a model of an alternative way of we, less I, for the world. I find it in the Center for Public Justice, which is bridging intractable political divides in Congress and gracefully weaving together different demographic and temperamental expressions of the sacred sector in local civic variations all over the US. I find it in the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, which is protecting and nurturing hundreds of universities that seek to develop global citizens who are resident aliens, First Peter resident aliens before they are Americans, alien reconcilers before self-appointed pundits. I find it in leadership foundations, a global irrigation system of faith-based organizations pumping with Ignatian discernment that is working to reweave the social fabric of cities with deep listening first to the currents that are already flowing, starting on the margins, rowing their way to the center. I find it in Bittersweet Monthly, a multimedia storytelling shop in our neighborhood that is building a community of people who are reading our times with compassion, helping the organizations often doing the most rugged work to dignify those whose humanity has been demeaned, to narrate what they do and how they do it. I find it in Detroit, in the cross-racial friendship Dwan Dandridge and Chris Lambert have established, a black man and a white man who are laboring arm in arm to break down barriers and build bridges in a city scarred by decades of racially charged neglect, government control, and whiplash, and a whole heck of a lot of earned mistrust towards perceived power. I find it in the Oaks Academy here in Indianapolis, a school that serves one of the more ethnically and socioeconomically diverse student bodies in the state, with a commitment to relationships and beauty as the foundation for all learning and character formation. I find it in Jacob's Ladder in Atlanta, a pioneering school for kids with severe intellectual disabilities whose compromised neural pathways are being rewired by an all-in marriage of science and love. I find the church sort of wafting its fragrance outward in the San Antonio Police Department, where the model of two hug-a-thugs, as they call themselves, named Ernie Stevens and Joe Smaro, two cops, are shifting a national policing conversation and foregoing norms around how we deal with mental health crises and police brutality. I find it in Together Chicago, a long-standing initiative of collective impact weaving together business leaders, faith leaders, and community, nonprofit, civic, and government leaders, effectively pursuing a more holistic, place-based approach to the intersecting needs of economic development, education, violence reduction, faith community mobilization. I find it in Sea Dog Theater, whose understanding of feasting, welcome, and the dance between the theater and the curiosity required to play a character well is disarming the sort of bundling quick judgments a lot of us are making today of others, charting out a path from the stage to the table, from alienation to reconciliation. I find it in my own institution that supports my work, sort of supports the intellectual narrative and institutional weaving work that I'm so lucky to get to do, Cardis, whose sort of intentional ecumenism internally and robust commitment to and humility before the common good externally just sort of takes your breath away with its moral coherence and its dynamism. I find the church in Chico, California, where a long-term recovery group propped up after the campfire of November 2018 that devastated the next-door town of Paradise is being led by an Episcopalian priest who never knew his calling to be a physician of relationships and a strategist to rebuild would flower so late into his life and vocation. He never knew that crisis and displacement would invite him to his Annunciation moment. I find it in Mako and Heijin Fujimura, whose marriage of beauty and justice are healing two long-torn assumptions that the gift logic is opposed to the logic of law and order. I find it embodied at Erebon, an organization which, with the leadership of David Bailey, is helping all kinds of institutions understand that better than just diversity, equity, and inclusion modalities is a still higher, harder, and holier aim of working towards embodying the reconciled community with all the humbling this requires and the mutual transformation it rewards. I find it in a place like Fuller Seminary, which is testing the possibility of spiritual unity in a divided age by experimenting with gatherings of very different people and theological streams around the sacramental grace of the Eucharist itself. What happens when your arguments circle around that table, when sacrifice itself is the center? And on and on and on. These communal and institutional exemplars sustain my hope, a kind of constellation of lily pads, no pun intended, that are less likely to be granted status within the institutional scaffolding of yesteryear, but are shining with strength as they follow the kind of gathering and scattering motif that the Hebrew Scriptures and then the New Testament carved out as the way. This is what you might call Christian humanism, resourcing a constructive way forward for a just and generous common life for everybody. A common life that works itself out through thick webs of formative institutions that in turn enable purposeful dialogue and relationship between friends and strangers over lifetimes in more and more contexts that begin to overlap. And what they have in common are a few things. Telos, they each have a clear, strong reason for being in the world that's embraced and pursued by all of its members. Liturgies and rituals, sort of a covenant or creed that is affirmed regularly as a community, both in word and deed. They have most of the members of their organizations and who they serve are fully engaged, each one of them aware of the significance of his or her role. They have clear conception of the whole person, that we are not just heads on sticks, but we yearn to be integrated. They tend to put relational health as the foundation for their success, sort of the ultimate end of excellence. They're careful often about the latest technological advance, embracing it insofar as it promotes healthy relationships and individual skill, and setting limits when it makes those objectives more difficult. They foster opportunities to relate to those unlike yourself, and they provide a structure of mutual accountability and opportunities for growth. They empower their people to act, create, initiate, and not simply rest as passive consumers or dehumanizing cogs in a machine. They hire people who can be character exemplars to the younger folks in their midst. And most noticeable, these communities, organizations, initiatives tend to be flooded with joy, transforming lives in kind of their sticky attraction and forming people in such a way that when they leave for another context, the people affected by that context tend to promote similar norms in the next place. These are institutions that have rejected sort of the performativity of our utilitarian age and chosen to be formative in a pluralistic time that is often reticent to define a universal good, a universal love. We just need more of them because we need the desert of this intermediating landscape to just be lit up, kind of like an electric grid. But what this beautiful spray of what you might call green shoots that answers, in a sense, my anguish of, church, where are you? What it lacks, I think, is the thick web part of that just and generous common life, a web that can be thickened by a unifying frame and the gift of connective tissue to undergird this is a fancy word David loves to use, and I don't know always how to pronounce it, but the archipelago of hope bubbling up sort of in our democratic lava. What's lacking is a cohesive narrative about the present amid deep knowledge of the past, with surprise pairings of words and ideas that make way for new categories to emerge, for new imagination, and thought leaders that put their grand theories humbly at the feet of these largely hidden heroes that are charting out a different moral economy in real time. This feels to me like a major challenge, an invitation of our moment, to build an imaginative, conceptual fireplace that resonates with these heroes and draws their individual sparks upward through one chimney towards one huge sky. This is the major task I see for philanthropy, that long-standing exceptional force in the American democracy Tocqueville so admired. Will philanthropy take its privilege of a high, broad perch and seed creatively a new set of intermediating institutions and dense overlapping networks that might allow top-down power to serve bottom-up beauty? Could philanthropists pour some miracle grow on all that is already blooming and just help give it a little philosophical fence and some cross-pollinating tools? That miracle grow, perhaps a better metaphor is miracle glue, is needed because I think we Americans are just experiencing too many chasms today, between black and white, between right and left, between self and neighbor, between the faith-drenched and the secular convinced, between newcomer and old-timer. To accept these chasms and not try to bridge them is to die as souls, as a society. But I don't think death should have or needs to have the final word. And I think David's particular way of seeing might just make that plain. So I'll let you come up here. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. We have, as I was sitting there thinking, we have similar minds, different communication styles. And the way I describe it, Anne is a painter and I'm a pointer. So after beautiful elegance, you're about to get journalism. Sorry for the come down. So I also am going to talk about community and connection. Unlike Anne, it's not natural to me. Anne, like when we leave a party, I'm like, okay, we're done here. And I'm out at the door in 30 seconds. She's 45-minute process of saying goodbye to everybody in the room because she actually cares about other people. And so, though I talk about community, I grew up in a home, some of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof, there's a certain kind of Jewish home that's filled with emotional ebullience and connection, and people are all huggy. I came from the other kind of Jewish home. So our phrase was, think Yiddish, act British. And so super stiff upper lip. And then I went to Grace Church School because it was in New York. I was part of the all Jewish boys davening choir at Grace. We were about 40% Jewish in our church choir. And to square it with our religion, we didn't sing the word Jesus. And so the volume would drop in the church and then it would come back up and we'd go on. And then when I was 8, I wanted to become a writer, which is not a very socially connected, it's a bit of a solitary profession. I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided at that moment I was going to be a writer. And I joked that in high school I wanted to date this woman named Bernice. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those are where my values were. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And so that too, if you know Chicago, not a very social place. The famous saying about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. My favorite saying about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so, but it's intellectual. It's not a social place. The students wear these T-shirts, sure it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And so in Chicago, I had a great education, but not a lot of social life. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was there. So there wasn't a lot of connection. Then I go into journalism, and you would think journalism is a social profession. We're interviewing people all the time. But actually, it's the kind of profession for somebody who wants to stand in the corner of the room and watch other people. And so I say to journalism students, if you're at a football game and everybody's doing the wave, and you just sit there, you have the right kind of aloof personality style to be a journalist. And so all of these are isolating. Coupled with that is this weird emotional non-reactivity that I hope I'm getting over with. But when super exciting things happen, I don't react. So if anybody's a baseball fan here, if you get a ball in the stands, that's like a big deal. You'd stand up on the Jumbotron. I have never had a ball. I've been to thousands of games. But I once sitting at Camden Yards in close to the dugout, and a batter swung and a bat landed in my lap. Now a bat is 1,000 times better than a ball. And what did I do? I just put it on the ground and sat there. It's like, why can't I be happy? But nonetheless, I'm going to tell you about connection. Those who can't do, teach. And I'm going to start, and the two things I'm going to emphasize in this talk related to Anne's are, and I talk about community, and we started Weave, which we'll talk about. I really think a lot of talk about community is too abstract. That what really matters is the actual social act of being with another person in all its most minute details. So that's going to be one of my themes tonight. And the second theme is going to be on moral formation, which Anne finished with, the lack of moral formation in this country and what it's done to us. So let me just start with the details of an encounter. Let me just tell three quick stories. One is a woman told me this story when she was a few months ago, but she was recounting a time when she was 13. She went to her first party. She got really drunk, and they got dropped off at home, first time ever having alcohol. She was so drunk she was just on the porch, she couldn't get in the front door. Her dad, a big, strict disciplinary, comes out on the porch, and she thinks he's going to scream at her, saying what she already has in her head, I'm bad, I'm bad. Instead, he just lifts her up, puts her on the couch, and says, there'll be no punishment here, you just had an experience. Second story. A friend of mine has a daughter in second grade, she's struggling. One day the teacher says to her, you know, you're really good at thinking before you speak. And that little comment took this girl's sense of awkwardness and turned it into a gift. The third story is not real, but hopefully some of you will know it's from the movie Good Will Hunting with Matt Damon and Robin Williams. Matt Damon plays this math whiz, but who has trouble relating. And Robin Williams is his therapist who is supposed to help him with his emotional problems, but which Will Hunting will not face. But he levels Robin Williams with his brilliance and his stereotypes and humiliates him. Williams calls him out to a pond, if you remember the scene, and says to him this, you're a tough kid. I ask you about war, you probably throw Shakespeare at me, right? Once more into the breach. But you've never been near one. You've never held your best friend's head in your lap and watched him gasp his last breath. I ask you about love, you quote me a sonnet. But you've never looked at a woman and been totally vulnerable, known someone who could level you with her eyes. I look at you, I don't see an intelligent, self-confident man. I see a cocky, scared kid. You're a genius, no one denies that, but I don't care about that. Because you know what? I can't learn anything from you that I can't learn in a book. Unless you want to talk about who you are, then I'm fascinated. I'm in, but you don't want to do that, do you, sport? Because you're terrified of what you might say. And so, why have I told you these three stories? The first one about the drunk girl, that's about seeing with understanding. The dad saw her and understood exactly what she was going through. The story about the teacher, that's affirming with insight. Lifting a talent that somebody has that maybe they don't even know they have. The third, the Robin Williams story, critiquing with care. Giving somebody a critique of themselves that they know something to do with, and it's done from a position of love. These are three important skills. And if you can do these skills, you will be a good teacher, a good leader, a good parent, a good friend, and a good citizen in your community. And so I've come to think that morality, sometimes it's written on commandments in stone, sometimes it's just social consideration. And it's possessing these skills. Now, what's the capacity that underlies these three skills? It's the ability to see others and understand what they're going through. And I've come to believe there's one skill at the center of every healthy church, organization, company, or society. It's the ability to make people feel seen, respected, and understood. And if people feel unseen, they will lash out in humiliation, and your plans will fall flat. If they feel seen, they'll follow you to the ends of the earth. And so how good are you at seeing? Some people are just phenomenal. Some of you may know a novelist, E.M. Forster. His biographer wrote of him, to speak to him was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity, you had to be your best, sharpest, most honest self. Who wouldn't want to be that guy? There's Winston Churchill's mom, when she was a young woman, had dinner one night with William Gladstone, a British statesman. And she left that dinner thinking, Gladstone is the most clever person in England. A couple weeks later, she had dinner with Gladstone's great rival, Benjamin Disraeli. She left that dinner thinking she was the most clever person in England. So it's good to be Gladstone, it's better to be Disraeli. So how good are you? Well, most of you I don't know very well, but I know the research, and you're not as good as you think you are. The average person is accurately perceiving what the other person is thinking in conversation 22% of the time. With a good friend or close family member, it rises to 35%. A lot of people are 0% but think they're 100%. And so we should be humble about how well we think we can know each other just based on our raw abilities. And as a result of our failure at this, we have an epidemic of blindness in our society. And this is what I see in my career as a journalist. So many people tell me I feel invisible, I feel unseen. When I come to this part of the country, it used to be interviewing people, once a trip, once a week, somebody would tell me, we're in flyover country, you don't really see us. By 2016, I heard that like 8 times a day in the Midwest. And so we have this epidemic of people feeling unseen. Blacks feeling their daily experience is not understood by whites, rural people not feeling seen by coastal elites, depressed people not feeling seen by anybody, Republicans and Democrats looking at each other in blind incomprehension, husband and wives in broken marriages who realize the person who should know them best has no clue. And so this is, to me, at the core of what's become a widespread and extremely mysterious social crisis. 54% of Americans say that no one knows them well. The number of adults without a romantic partner is up by 1/3. There's been a 73% increase in depression since 2007. The percentage of students suffering from anxiety disorders has doubled between 2008 and 2019. Teenage suicide is up by 58%. Just 45% of Gen Z says their mental health is good. 27% of Americans are estranged from a member of their immediate family. These are all seemingly unrelated, but they all have to do with this crisis of connection. And I see it in my own life. Most of my friends are very fortunate, but they still have this level of anxiety or exhaustion that Ann spoke about. I gave a talk in Oklahoma recently. All the questions came on index cards. I opened the index card, and it says, what do you do if you no longer want to be alive? It's like, I didn't know what to say. And then I asked my friends what to say, and it turns out that so many of them had suicide somewhere in their family or depression. And so most of us are fine, but there's this undercurrent of disconnection and sadness, but it's not the sadness that bothers me or that really worries me, bad as that is. It's what people do with sadness. Anton Chekhov, the great Russian short story writer, wrote a story called Enemies. It's about 2 guys who suffer grievous losses in one day. One guy loses his son, the other loses his wife. You would think they would be bound by suffering, but there's social inequality between them. The nobleman who lost his wife looks down on the doctor who lost his son. And this is a toxin that creates hate. And Chekhov's point is that when people are lonely, they will experience that loneliness as a rejection, as a humiliation, as an injustice. And when they experience rejection, humiliation, injustice, they lash out and they're angry. And so I gave you a bunch of statistics just now on disconnection. There's also an equal number of statistics on hostility and lack of empathy. Gun sales have been surging. Reckless driving is so bad that even though miles driven is down, highway deaths are up. Disruptive classroom incidents are tripling. As your institute found, it used to be almost 2/3 gave to charity. Now it's fewer than half of Americans give to charity. The recorded scores of empathy dropped among college students by 40% between 2000 and 2010. The person who would score average 20 years ago on empathy would now be in the 76th percentile. And so we're just becoming a more hostile, more angry culture. It's, as my colleague Peggy Noonan says it, people are proud of their bitterness now. We were just in a restaurant in New York, and the owner was chatting with us. He now has to regularly ban people from life for bad behavior. We were had lunch with a friend. He runs COVID policy in San Diego. His house got firebombed in the middle of the night. The death threats are just normal. And so authoritarians thrive in a social environment like this one. Authoritarians tell stories of betrayal and loss. They feed on those who were humiliated. Dictatorship, Hannah Arendt, bases itself on loneliness, which is among the most radical and desperate experiences of man. For those who feel they have no place in society, it is through surrendering themselves to ideology and power that the loneliness rediscover their purpose and self-respect. And so in this way, a private psychological emotion turns into a social problem. So what the hell is going on? What's causing all this? Some people tell a technology story. Social media is driving us crazy. Some people tell an economic story. The economy is more fragile and unequal. Some people tell a demographic story. We're moving from a mostly white country to a much more diverse country. Some people tell a sociology story. We're bowling alone, lack of community. I agree with all these stories. I don't think any of them is the deepest story. Sure, social media has bad effects, but social media is everywhere. Our problems are American. Economic inequality is real, but America endured depressions and economic crises before without this level of emotional breakdown. Demographics are changing, but it's not just white people who are suffering through all these depression, it's everybody. Sociologists are right that we're more isolated. But why? What values cause us to lead lives that make us miserable? And so to me, the core story is a failure of moral education. A core story to teach, first of all, the skills of how to treat people well, how to be considerate, how to be, in the words of this institute, how to be generous. And it's a failure of social skill. Basically, our social skills are inadequate to the society we now live in. And so let me tell you a quick historical narrative that explains why I think we got here. There was 100 years ago an age of character formation. People were obsessed with character in the 1890s, 1900s. Mary Woolley is a hero of mine. She ran Mount Holyoke College. Character is the main object of education, she wrote. College training gives purpose to life. College training teaches self-control. She saw her job as an educator to mold the character of her students. This ethos was built on a certain view of human nature, which is a Christian view of human nature, that we're gloriously made but deeply broken. It's built on a nature awareness of sin, a word that is now mostly used in the context of desserts. And so the idea was that because we are sinful, you can't just stay the way you are. You have to improve yourself through formation. And you have to surrender to institutes that will teach you how to do this. Because otherwise, your life will be inadequate. And so if you go back 100 years, people, as I say, were obsessed with it. The Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts were obsessed with formation. They read these stories to their kids. Little Red Riding Hood is a story about a girl who surrenders to passion and gets devoured by a wolf or about to be devoured by a wolf. That's a story about moral formation. There was a movement that swept across Europe called Bildung, a German word for moral formation. And they redid education across Europe, and especially in Scandinavia. I went to a college at Chicago, which was an offshoot of that. The great books education that I received was based on the idea that you come in, as George Eliot said, a moral idiot. But if you read the great books of literature and think about them deeply, you will have the keys to life. It was formative. Churches. What are churches about? The worship of God and the formation of Christians. And so these were deeply formative institutions. And there were two ideas that were popular in that age, which have been largely discarded today. The first idea is that there exists an objective moral order to the universe, that things are truly beautiful, truly right, and truly wrong, and that it's true for everybody. The second idea was people educate their moral senses by being obedient to that order, deferential to the authorities that uphold this order, whether it's parents, school principals, bosses, clergy, great leaders. And so it's we all know the Eugene Peterson book, Along Obedience in the Same Direction. There was some hint of obedience and being formed by your institutions, whether it was law, medicine, clergy. That all went away, or at least as the mainstream of American life. Conservatives blame the 60s, but it really didn't happen in the 60s. It happened in the 40s. Between 1929 and 1945, Americans were in depression and war, long period of restraint. 45 comes, the consumer revolution comes, the suburbs come, people say, to heck with that, we're done with restraint. And so that you get this process of unleashing. Along comes people like Carl Rogers, Dr. Spock. There's a guy named Joshua Liebman who wrote a book that was #1 on the bestseller list for an entire year. There was The Power of Positive Thinking. All these books had one message. All that stuff about human sin, that's old-fashioned. That's repressive. People are basically good. It's the institutions that are corrupt. And so there's no need for formation. You're basically good. All you have to do is detach yourself from institutions, and your goodness will flower forth. And if you go to a commencement speech, it's like, find your passion. Look for your true self inside. First we saddle the next generation with a mountain of debt, then we give them crap advice, so they'll never be able to pay it off. And so many theologians and philosophers, most importantly Charles Taylor and Alasdair MacNamara, have written about this. The ethos of autonomy, the ethos of authenticity. It's all, the goodness is in here, and I'm just wonderful. It did not produce what they hoped. It produced the statistics I just read. So what do they do if you give people freedom and it turns out to be chaos? Well, they escape from freedom. People escape from freedom that feels dangerous. They did this in Germany in the 1930s. They escaped from freedom into Hitler. I covered Russia in the 1990s. They escaped from freedom into Putin. We don't quite have that problem. We have a less serious problem. We escape from freedom into politics. That we have what Aidan Hurst, political scientists, call political hobbyists. They don't canvass, they don't volunteer, they just get emotional about politics all the time. And in such a society, everything becomes politicized. Corporations become politicized, churches become politicized, friendships become politicized, politics is everywhere. I wrote a piece about the decline of the chaos in the Evangelical church. And what struck me was how many pastors said, it's Fox News, not the gospel. I told the group earlier today, I had a buddy who put the sentences from the Beatitudes into his sermons, and the people came up to after him, but he didn't say where he got them. They were just in the Sermon on the Mount. And the congregants would come up and say, I didn't like that part. I was too woke. But we have politics infecting everywhere. Except this is not politics as normally understood. Normally, politics is about redistribution. Where should money go? Where should power go? This is politics about recognition. Do you see me? Do I have status? Do I get to humiliate you? So political movements are filled by social resentment these days. I want to feel emotionally validated, and I want you to feel emotionally shamed. Oppression gets redefined as psychological injury. And when you do that, there's no solution. If you think of oppression as being slighted, you'll always find a way to feel slighted. The politics of recognition appears to produce psychic benefits. It appears to produce a sense of belonging, but being part of the same political movement is not friendship and volunteering. Politics seems to provide a sense of morality. I'm fighting against evil. But basically, it takes the Christian view of human nature that the line between good and evil runs down every human heart, and it externalizes it. The line between good and evil runs between my group and their group. Finally, politics is just not going to get you the things you really need in your life, which is a sense of tenderness and care and support and love and friendship. And so the psychologists have a phrase, the hardest thing to cure is the patient's attempt to self-cure. People have problems, they adopt solutions that make it all worse, like alcohol commonly or drugs. We have adopted politics to make it all worse. So let's return to Anne's phrase for a podcast, the whole person. You have to recast, get out of politics, and see people in their full humanity. I'm going to tell you a quick story that I hope will help us do this. It's about a guy named Emmanuel Carrera, who on December 26, 2004, went with his girlfriend and their respective sons to Sri Lanka, stayed on a hilltop hotel. And he had once thought this woman he was with, Helene, would be the love of his life, the one he would marry. But at Christmas, the night before, they talked about separating. And Carrera was thinking, yeah, I don't love her. And it's sad because she's worthy of love. But the fact is, and this is him thinking, I've never loved anyone. He went back and thought about all his broken relationships in his past, and he realized, I'm just incapable of love. And then he self-pityingly thought forward into his future and said, I'll probably die alone because I just don't know how to love anybody. So a mood of bored irritability settled over the little group, and they decided the next morning not to do a scuba diving lesson they'd signed up for. And that was consequential because that was the morning the tsunami hit. If you remember the tsunami of 2004. Earlier, a couple days earlier, they met another French family, a guy named Jerome, his wife Delphine, and their little 4-year-old daughter Juliette. When the tsunami hit, Juliette was playing in the waves. Her granddad was on the beach reading a paper. Her parents were in town shopping. Her granddad felt himself get swept up by a big wall of black water and had two thoughts. The first is, I'm going to die. And the second was, Juliette already has. He gets swept inland. The water begins to start taking him out to sea. He happens to run into a palm tree at the top. He grabs it, a piece of fence pins him to the palm tree. He survives. He comes down bloodied and bruised and decides, I got to go tell her parents. So he walks into town, he spots them across the square, realizes they're experiencing their last moment of pure happiness. And he tells them, and his career writes, Delphine screamed, Jerome didn't. He took Delphine in his arms and hugged her as tightly as he could while she screamed and screamed. And from then on, he had only one objective. I can no longer do anything for my daughter, so I will save my wife. And so Carrera spends the next couple weeks with that family, with Jerome and Delphine, and he watches Delphine absorb the blows. He watches her, she barely eats anything, but when she brings a fork full of rice to her mouth, he can see her hand is shaking. Her husband, Jerome, is watching her constantly, trying to will her to stay with us, stay with us. Helene, meanwhile, has gone out and she's one of those people in crisis who becomes super practical and super useful. She's like arranging insurance, doing practical details, getting food, helping other people who've survived. And over meals, Jerome is still trying to save his wife. And so the meals are strangely loud because he's wanting to fill the space with upbeat stories, with jokes. He's pouring drinks. Carrera watches him, Jerome the father. And he says, I watched him out of the corner of the eye, keeping watch over Delphine. And I remember thinking, there it is, real love. A man who truly loves his wife. There is nothing more beautiful. But Delphine remained silent, absent, horribly calm. And so this is just a profound emotional experience for all of them. But a couple weeks later, Jerome, or Emmanuel, the writer here, realizes that he does love Helene. and he must marry her. He writes, "I tell myself that this long life together must happen. If I need to succeed at one thing before I die, it is this." And Helene remembers those weeks as the time they really came together. So why have I told you this story? First, it's about human solidarity, basic human solidarity. Second, it's about responsibilities defined by your role. Finally, and most importantly for my purposes, it's about how an entire world viewpoint and a consciousness can be transformed by an event. Usually, over the course of our lives, our viewpoint on life changes gradually. There's a famous thing called the Grant Study, where they took a bunch of Harvard guys in the 1940s and followed them through life. And one of the guys was a prig in college, kind of insufferable. Then he loosened up and apparently became a great guy to be around. And the researchers in the Grant Study, when he was about 70, sent him the interview transcripts from when he was 20. And he sent them back and said, "This is the wrong guy. None of this ever happened to me. I never thought any of this. You sent the wrong transcript." And they said, "No, that was you." Usually it happens over a lifetime. In this case, it happened all at once. And to me, it's a reminder that each of us is a viewpoint. We take all the experiences and emotions of our lives and we create a distinct point of view. Each person creates their own way of being aware. And if you want to see and know somebody, you have to have some hint about how they are seeing you. Aldous Huxley put it, experience is not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. And so this is just a deeply human act that we do every second, consciously and unconsciously. So I think we're all amazing artists of the real. We are amazing artists. We are made in the image of God. God is a creator. We are participants in his creation, but we are also creating this viewpoint. How would you want to get to know a creature that amazing? And first, you don't want to study them like they're some object. You want to illuminate them with your love. You want to beam at them the kind of loving attention and considerate care that Rembrandt beamed at people. I've been lucky enough to be interviewed twice by Oprah. I can tell you, when she looks at you, you are illuminated. And so that concept of made in the image of God is the foundation for how you want to look at somebody with reverence, awe, and respect. You want to look at them as a soul. I'm not normally in this business, all this stuff. So I tell secular people, I don't care if you believe in God or not believe in God, that's up to somebody else. But I ask you to believe that every person you meet has some piece of them that has no size, weight, color, or shape, but gives them infinite value and dignity, and it's called a soul. And if you treat them as if they have an eternal soul, you'll probably treat them right. And so you want to illuminate them with that kind of understanding. The Bible was so smart about cognition. To know in the Bible is not a cold, rational thing. It can mean everything from study to have sex with, to enter a covenant with. It's an emotional thing. And the Bible is filled with dramas of recognition. Esau. The disciples don't recognize the risen Christ. And the parable of the Good Samaritan. A lot of people see the injured guy on the side of the road, but only the Samaritan really sees him. And these failures of unseeing are not failures of the mind, they're failures of the heart. And so you want to imitate the kind of love that God uses to see us. So that's the first stage. The second stage is a word Anne used, which Pope Francis loves, accompaniment. That's an other-centered way of just doing life with people. Most of our lives is not in deep conversations or spiritual epiphany. It's going to the carpool. It's going to the meeting. It's just normal. But some people have an other-centered way of doing that reminds you of the way a pianist accompanies a singer. They just want to make the other person a little more impressive. And we've all known people like that. It's just a faithful presence, open to what may come. Your movements are not marked by willfulness, but willingness. You're willing to go wherever the relationship leads. And that kind of accompaniment is, to me, the second thing. And then the third thing, and the most important skill that we teach the least, is conversation. If you think empathy can get you into another person's mind, you have excessive faith in your mind reading skills. You have to ask them a question. And so and I'll conclude with this, I've collected a lot of conversation skills. And I want to emphasize that talking about big morality, it comes down to minute skills, just the way being a carpenter or a painter or anything else. And so here are some I've read from conversation experts. Treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. If you're going to be there, be all the way there or not at all. 2, be a loud listener. I have a friend who, when he listens to you, it's like he's at some charismatic church. It's like, yeah, preach. Love talking to that guy. He's a loud listener. Make them authors, not witnesses. When people tell stories, they don't put in enough detail. If you ask them, where was your boss when he said that? Then they get right into the scene and they tell you a lot more, and you really have a good conversation. Do the looping. When somebody says something, paraphrase what they say and say it back to them. You'll be shocked at how often you misheard them. Keep the gem statement at the center. If you disagree about something, there's probably something underneath that you agree about. My brother and I could argue about our dad's health care, but we both want what's best for our dad. That's the gem statement. Don't fear the pause. When you're listening to somebody, say they start talking here, and they talk to the end of their fingers, at what point have you stopped listening so you can think of what to say next? Probably about here. So let them finish to their fingers and then pause. Find the disagreement under the disagreement. If you're having a big argument, there's probably a deeper philosophical reason you're having a big argument. Work together to find that thing. It'll be fun. And then finally, the most important things are questions. Good questions are just honoring. Kids are phenomenal at asking questions. They ask great questions. I have a friend named Niobe Way who teaches interviewing skills to 8th grade boys. So one day in class, she said, okay, interview me. I'll answer any question you ask me. First question was, are you married? No. Second question, are you divorced? Yes. Third question, do you still love him? Woo. She paused and said, well, I told him I'd answer honestly, so she said yes. Bad questions, evaluative. What do you do? What college did you go to? Sometimes, what neighborhood do you live in? Good questions are open questions. There's a focus group lady who was asked to study why people go to the supermarket late at night. So she could have asked the focus group, why do you go to the supermarket late at night? The better question was an open question. Tell me about the last time you went to the supermarket late. And there was a lady in the focus group who said, well, I just smoked a joint and I needed a menage a trois with me, Ben and Jerry. And good answer. Introductory questions, like, how'd you get your name? Tell me about a time you felt you belong. Tell me about a favorite childhood memory. Then as you get to know someone, you can ask wide-angle questions that get them to step back and evaluate their lives. What crossroads are you at? Most of us are at a crossroads, but we won't think about it until somebody asks. What would you do if you weren't afraid? Fear is in our lives somewhere, but how? What problem did you used to have that you don't have licked? Deeper, what is the forgiveness you're withholding? Peter Block is a great community thinker. He's got great questions. What is the no or refusal you keep postponing? What have you said yes to that you no longer really believe in? What forgiveness are you withholding? I already said that one. And so these are just questions that produce better conversations. And if somebody asks you that question, and you're in a conversation like that, you walk away thinking, A, that guy's a pretty good listener. B, you feel great. You feel heard and you feel seen. And so the big issues of our day ultimately come down to these minor, detailed social skills. And when you feel seen and heard, like the lady who got drunk on the porch, you remember it forever. And I'll close with a time I wasn't seen, but I was a seer, which is also pretty fantastic, when you actually feel like you know somebody. And this happened about a year ago. I was sitting at our dining room table, and I was reading some boring book, and Anne walked in the front door of our house, which you can see from the table, and she stood in the doorway with the afternoon light coming in behind her, and she happened to glance at an orchid that we kept on the table by the door. And she, her absentmindedly looking at the orchid. I look up and I think, wow, I really know her. I know her through and through. And if you'd asked me what I knew, it wouldn't have been the biographical facts or the personality traits. It was just the ebb and flow of her being. It was the way that she responds, the way she sees the world. And I wasn't even seeing her in a normal way. I was beholding her. That's the only word I can think of to describe what it was like, beholding. And people tell me they sometimes have that thought when someone they really love, they just behold them. Like you don't have to do anything with it, you just behold. And it was almost as if I wasn't seeing her, I was seeing a little out from her. And perhaps to know someone, you have to have a glimmer how they experience the world. To know someone, you have to know how they know you. And so I spend my days writing about politics and the grandest schemes. I'm spending my week thinking about Ukraine and globalization. But it comes down to the details of social relationship. The social practices we either are good at or not good at. And when we screw those up on a micro scale, they have gigantic macro effects. And so to me, our focus of philanthropy as churches have to be on these two things. The moral formation, so people don't feel existentially and ontologically panicked, and the social skills of actual relationship. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. And will you join me in thanking them for these wonderful remarks? My name is Melissa Spaz, and it is my distinct honor to welcome David and Ann, to have them here for these really thoughtful and provocative starts to a conversation. And so we will continue in that direction. Grateful to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Una Osili, and excited to have the chance to talk a little bit further about the things that you have shared, particular to Lake Institute's distinct interest in the intersection of faith and giving. And so I want to begin by asking you to go in a very practical direction. Our constituency is full of religious institutions and the people who lead them. And I wonder, for those who would seek to overcome division, to really contribute to the reweaving of the social fabric, what encouragement would you offer? Are there things that might be clear next steps for clergy or other religious leaders to consider?
I feel very, in some ways, unequipped and humble answering that question, just because I think we probably all know so many pastors and religious leaders who are kind of like a battering ram right now. They're being treated like pundits. They weren't ever trained to be pundits. So mostly, I feel like there isn't a lot, there's a sense in which I just sort of want to give them rest. I think the one thing that comes to mind is, and I think I'll take this off, just a principle, right? These days, I think if you could do two things in your congregation, in some sort of a faith-based institution, go deep internally, meaning really think through like your call to form, that you are in the formative enterprise, and then when it comes to external, it's not about commenting on the state of affairs or like choosing a political line, but going wide and like how can we be useful, how can we serve outward? So sort of like wide, mile wide out, and maybe more narrow deep internally in terms of spiritual formation, moral formation. You're going to give some wonderful stories.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, all the pastors I know are exhausted too. And Russell Moore, who was in the Southern Baptist Convention until he had to leave for being upset about racism and sexual abuse, he said the most spiritually unhealthy people are the loudest, and the most spiritually healthy people are the quietest, because they don't want to get involved. And so I think one thing is to find the spiritually healthy people and try to not to get them just to hang back. The second thing Russell said is that we've always had people leave the church, but usually it was because they didn't believe what the church teaches. Now it's because they think we don't believe what the church teaches. And so it is, I mean, I became a Christian because I saw a beautiful Christian witness. I mean, that was not the whole reason, but that was an important reason. Yeah. And so doing that work of acting on behalf of the marginalized is just practical stuff. I'm so impressed by Walter Kim, who runs the National Endowment for the Arts, no, the other NEA, National Association of Evangelicals, NAE. And so I asked him, what are your two missions? And he's got a very broad movement, a lot of Trumpies, a lot of anti-Trumpies. He said, we have two missions right now, our priorities. One is racial reconciliation, and the other is civic education. Churches have courses for marriage. They should have courses for citizenship. I asked Tim Keller what churches should do, and he had a whole list with the budgets. And they were things like redo Christian education. He has a thing called the Christian Mind Project to get evangelicals, but all Christians in elite universities, frankly, to pepper them. He said in a couple decades ago, there were these great youth ministries, University and New Life, it's called. Those are great, but we need modern versions. And so there are all these practical things that can be done to spread, salt and light. And the only final thing I'll say is, and this I say to Christian college presidents in particular, but I think it applies to clergy, which is simply be not afraid. Like, I teach at a secular school to secular students, and they hunger for spiritual language, which they do not have. The church has this resource, and so sharing that resource, this, first of all, a presence of the good, and then 2,000 years of Christian social teaching, it's just an awesome resource for a moment that is over-politicized and under-moralized.
Thank you. I really appreciate your reflections on that. And as you were speaking earlier, I thought accompaniment. I see clergy skilled and practiced in that, and not knowing where to apply it. Helpful direction. I have a related question, or a similar question about what you observe. And you named so many powerful examples of local expressions of vitality. But I was struck by the metaphor that you used for philanthropy, miracle grow, miracle glue. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the most promising steps that you see from philanthropic actors, either individual philanthropists or foundations. How do you see philanthropy positively making that contribution?
Yeah, I think obviously there's millions and millions of dollars that have been spent, like we were talking earlier today with some really thoughtful staff at the Lilly Endowment about the early days of the pandemic and what were the judgment calls that need to be made as like this onslaught of need came your way. I think we were all so aware back in March of 2020, just to take that as an example of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And even if you're like a very intellectually erudite foundation like Lilly is, there are these needs of, shelter and food and employment and childcare and all of that. And so I want to say first that is like timeless work, and that is good. I think given the gravity of and the scale of and kind of the invisibility in a way, like the soft territory of what feel like the challenges of a nation, I would say a little bit falling apart or feeling weak or precarious. I've just found it so helpful. You know, I didn't intend to be a writer. I was sort of illuminating, or maybe mistakenly in list form, but I really learned from doers, and I always thought I would be like digging ditches, building water systems, and then somewhere along the way, someone was like, you seem to have a musical bent with words that could be helpful to those of us doing the doing. So I have found myself like in this weaving business in a bit of a surprising way, where I've noticed the power of just like a framework, a question. And I have found philanthropists to be very helpful these days at curating a wise room of doers and thinkers together. Like you know, there's this particular urgent question, say, around how do we get beyond ideology in our various institutional sectors? And I could call up, I haven't done this, but I could call up Clay Robbins or someone else from like 3 other foundations I could name, and they'd be like, you know, you need to talk to these 5 other people and put them in a room together, kind of championing the difficult room. So I have found that really, really helpful. I think just the questions that I get asked, and this is myself as someone who needs to get grants and so on, I've just found the questions that philanthropists ask can be very clarifying to your overall mission. Yeah, in some ways, I see philanthropy as kind of both has the potential to do at least find the right people to help with the conceptual framework that I think we're all yearning for, that could be uniting across our various factions, and just be the invitational catalyst to clear conceptions of good work in the world.
Yeah. We have a billboard near our home that I drive by from time to time, and it has the Powerball and Mega Millions numbers.
Not in our home.
No, near our
home. Okay.
Yeah, I always want to know. And so I drive by it, and sometimes the numbers are big, like, you know, the Mega Millions Powerball, 350 million or whatever. And I think, wow, what would happen if I won? And then I think, I'd have to give it away. That would be so hard. And so then the thought that I'm not going to win or even enter comes as a great relief, that I don't have to give away money. Because giving away money is so hard. I guess the 2 things that leap to mind is sort of, I'd go back to what I said, like having a secular version of moral formation that is either a curriculum or a set of organizations or a set of meetings. We're not going back to the days of Theodore Roosevelt. We're not that earlier age of formation that I described. It had its own problems, believe me. So we need a new way to think about moral formation. And the reason they were so active about moral formation 100 years ago was because they understood religion was losing its grip on the country. And they both, people in the church and outside the church, said, no, we have to find a secular version. And so I think that needs to happen. As you can tell from my speech, I think just social skill building needs to happen. And I think of and then the final thing I'll say, and I'll bring in Weave, the group I chair now. I used to run it, now I just chair it, which means I don't do squat. But and this alludes to what Ann said. We would go into a town and we would just say, who's trusted here? And within an hour, we had 75 names. And often they were the same names, people knew who was trusted. And so those people are already in place, and this is the point of Ann's list. They don't need to be invented, they're already there. And I learned through this work, and they're like some of the people Ann mentioned, Living Hope and all the people, Mac, McCarter, and Shreveport. The neighborhood already knows what to do. 2, the neighborhood is the unit of change. You want to flood the zone in each neighborhood and throw a lot, because we don't know what changes neighborhoods. But if you throw enough stuff in it, maybe it'll work. Right. And so to me, it's about overlapping instances in a geographic location. And what we do at Weave now partly is we have these things called Weaver Awards, where we ask people in a community who's trusted here. Then they get to vote on who is the best weaver, and then we give them small gifts of $15,000 or $25,000, which to them is not small. And then we bring them together into a cohort, so that we've created hopefully a new generation of civic leaders. The hardest part, getting them to joined together as a cohort. There's division in every community. It's just way more complicated than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are some ideas.
Thank you.
I should say, what somebody once asked me, I can't help resist. Somebody once asked me, what would you do if you had $500 million? And I said, I'd start summer camps, because summer camps changed my life. And the pastor of my summer camp, Carol, is somewhere in the room here. There she is. Yeah. So Carol knew me when I didn't have a first name. I was just Brooksy.
Well, thank you to both of you. It's been really a pleasure, an honor, and a delight to hear your reflections and your observations from around the country and around the world. At the Lilly Family School, many of you know that we've been collecting data on how Americans give for the past 2 decades. And for a long time, giving was very stable. It was actually one of those most consistent observations about how Americans behave. 2/3 of Americans gave, and it did not change very much. And around the time of the Great Recession, we saw those numbers start to decline, and they've continued, even post-Great Recession. Now, we are in a new moment. All of us can agree the world is very different, and there are signs that people are more aware of the needs of their neighbors, and there may be more interest in generosity. We also have new tools for giving that are available. So there are both reasons to be optimistic about the future of giving and generosity, but there are also reasons to be concerned. What we don't know yet, because we're still in the pandemic, as Anne has noted, is what we can do now to make sure that the future of giving, of generosity, is as robust as possible. So I wanted both of you to reflect on, we have a whole audience here. What can all of us do to help build that more resilient, philanthropic, both nonprofits, leaders, religious communities, and so forth?
Can I ask you first,
Yes.
that decline, who was it among? Was it among the rich, the poor, the highly educated? How much of it is a function of more people are on church? Like, break down those numbers to understand.
About 1/3 of the decline is, and we have several colleagues who worked on this project, is economics. So it's income, employment, and wealth. The other half, roughly, is what we call unobservable. So things like religious practice, religious participation. Trust is a big one. So that's how we have been able to decompose that. In terms of who has stopped giving, mostly lower income Americans, less educated households, and a point that I'm most concerned about, younger Americans are less likely to give. And I think all of us have a responsibility with that group in particular, because all of us have young people in our families, we work with, we play with, and so forth.
So my first reaction is to go back to the word you used, which was trust. And so 2 generations ago, if you asked me, well, do you trust your neighbors, what they call interpersonal trust, it was like 50 or 60%. So yeah, I trust my neighbors. Now it's 30.3%. And there are 2 groups that are extremely low on trust. One is the poor and the disaffected. And it should be said their distrust is earned distrust, because society has not been trustworthy. And the second group that's really low on trust is young people. So boomers, if you ask them, can you trust your neighbors, it's still 40%. For Gen Z, it's 19%. Each cohort is successively more distrustful than the one before it. And Robert Putnam, who at Harvard, says that it's, you form your levels of trust by your perceptions of the world at about 22, and you tend to keep it through life. And so they were 22 in 2008, or they've seen the Iraq War, they've seen, they've seen a society that doesn't look very trustworthy. And when you have low trust, you have what Francis Fukuyama calls spontaneous sociability, just hanging out, like joining together to do stuff together. And so I would imagine it would be that. And so the question becomes, how do you rebuild trust? And I asked sociologists and political scientists this question, and trust scholars, and they all say, don't know, never seen it. But my hope, and the reason I went through all those social skills, my hope is that trust is rebuilt in the particular. And that once you have particular trusting relationships, then you begin to have generalized trust. But it has to be built in the most minute social encounters. That's my guess. I'm a
Excellent.
journalist, so I don't study, I just have a guess.
Well, I like that. Thank you. Anne, do you have anything to add?
I would probably just say that with an amen in a slightly different way, which is some of those institutions and communities that I found that clearly seem to transform people's lives. And when you ask people, boomers and up, name a formative institution, most of them can reel off 1 to 3. When you ask younger people, they really hem and haw a little bit because of the trust issue, where, I think millennials, Gen Z are more known for leaving institutions. And when I think about giving, so much of it, at least initially, or that impulse, is out of an experience of trust and love. So it's sort of, there's an element of how do we just somehow create more institutions that are worthy of trust and love, and there's an element of just emotional overflow. That's a sort of a simple answer. I think there's something else going on. This is spitballing a little, again, not data behind this, but you often talk about, I don't know if you would say this now, but years ago you said, I wish if PBS could do not just a political show, but a culture show. We're so over-politicized, under-culturalized, and under-moralized in sort of the public domain. And I somehow feel like that relates to giving. I don't quite know. I feel like most of our initiating activity these days, whether it's with our resources, with our words, is in sort of a framework of warfare and defensiveness and find your team, not a very different logic. Like a generative logic is more of a gardening one, more of an artistic one. There's something self-emptying. And so this is just me sort of reading the psychology of it, but I think we're just in a mode where, for many understandable reasons, I think a lot of people just feel very sort of survival, self-protective. And it doesn't mean they don't care, but something hasn't awakened them in that way. So, but
Can I ask one more question about the nature of philanthropy?
Sure.
So when I think of young people and giving, I think of GoFundMe campaigns. Is that a significant amount of giving, given the whole raft of philanthropy? Because what strikes me is that young people do seem to be active in GoFundMe campaigns, and they're weirdly, it's gift without institution. They're spawned by an actual example, and then they just want to give money to that, directly to that thing, without giving it to some institution in the middle.
Yeah,
Yes, that's a very good point. We have, in fact, the school just launched a study. You're learning a lot about the school's research as well, where we found that 1/3 of Americans have given through a crowdfunding campaign. What's interesting, though, from the data is most people who are giving to crowdfunding are also giving to philanthropic institutions. So if you're generous to your neighbors and friends informally, or less formally, you're also giving to charitable organizations. So at least at this point, one isn't crowding out the other.
That's interesting.
One last question, actually, for both of you. Given the escalating situation in Ukraine and its surrounding countries, one of our questions is, how do we balance generosity at home and abroad? We're all called on to really think about how we can make a difference. And we get this question a lot from students. How can I get involved locally, but I also want to help globally? How have you seen this play out, especially in the data stories you've collected around the country, but in your case, we're seeing a lot of generosity that's global in nature. And just how are people balancing the numerous ways they can get involved?
Yeah, it felt like 15 years ago, and I think you were actually an example of this 15 or 20 years ago, that people were quite focused abroad. Like Paul Farmer was the model, and Bill Gates was focused on abroad. And in part, I toured Africa a few times during the AIDS crisis, and the first time I went with a friend of ours named Mike Gerson, who worked in the Bush White House, you were just watching people die, like people were in the hospitals just dying. I went like 5 years later, again with Mike, and it was like going to the pharmacy. People would just show up at the hospital, they'd get their ARV drugs, and they go home. And it was one of the most remarkable transformations I've ever seen in my life, from mass death to mass survival. And Mike was instrumental in the creation of PEPFAR, the President's Program about HIV in Africa. And that seemed to change, you may know the data on this, around 2013, 2014. I have a lot of theories about what happened in 2013 before 2014. A lot of social indicators all of a sudden move. And so it became focused at home. And you began to, especially, there was always, people always vastly overestimate how much foreign aid and vastly disapprove of it. but it really kicked in my perception. And so now, frankly, my attention has turned at home, because the crises in our country is just so big, and yet you can do so much abroad with relatively little money. The final thing I'd say is that the process abroad is the same as the process here. The spread of mental health is worse here than anywhere, but it's not unknown elsewhere. The struggle between democracy and authoritarianism is worse in some other places, but we got it here. I mean, if you look at the project that we in the West tried to build after World War II, it had a few pillars, and I don't want to judge it. We called it modernization, which was a very terrible way to frame it, because it assumed, like, we're modern, the rest of the world is going to catch up and be like us. But those pillars were, we assumed there'd be spreading democracy. That is now in reverse. The number of democracies is shrinking. We assumed there'd be spreading globalization. That is now in reverse. The amount of global trade, foreign direct investment, cross borders, all down. We assumed that there'd be rising secularism around the world. That's now in reverse, not so much here. We assumed that social science technocracy would solve all our problems. We'd all conduct studies and we could solve all our problems. That's pretty much in reverse. And so an entire vision of the future that a lot of us lived with and assumed has now swung in reverse. And so there's been a rise of some other future, and I don't want to call it, I don't like the phrase democracy versus authoritarianism, because if you go to China, I don't think that's how they see it. And so we have to, even understanding what the real contest of the current moment is I think we don't really have good words for it yet. But it is global, and so helping weave the fabric of society here is often similar to weaving the fabric of society. Our health issues are not as bad, but we're catching up to the rest of the world, or catching down, or whatever you want to say.
That was a smarter answer than I'm going to give, which is just that I think if I were speaking to like a 21-year-old right now, I wouldn't have a formula. I would really resonate with the tensions and the overwhelm. And I think I would just say we all have resources, and like naming those, particularly in my case, I feel really lucky. You know, I have a little platform. I have a body of writers, and I'm really interested in questions of democracy and what can we learn from what's going on right now in Ukraine. I was talking earlier about sort of the health of their civil society, and knowing some folks over there who are testifying to this like actually thick, underwoven, collaborative energy in various cities that is actually the untold story. It's not just military. And there's things that I'm like trying to do just through the written word, both voices over there, stories that need to be told, but also I would say friendship, you know, trying to pursue friendship, like any kind of relational exposure that allows you, I'm thinking of right after the invasion, I woke up, I think it was the Friday morning, or it was Thursday morning, Friday morning, and just thought of this woman who had become a refugee as a result of the Bosnia-Serbia conflict, and I just immediately thought of her and got on the phone, and I sort of was just asking, you know, what is war and what is peace? Like, these are silly questions in some ways, but having that illumination, she wound up writing a beautiful piece for us. Her family became refugees like 18 years ago in that conflict, and she's now walking with multiple Ukrainians, trying to get them to safety from afar. And she just she wanted to articulate for Americans that war is all of the things of normal life. It is kindness, it is selfishness, it is anger, it is great joy and love, it is all the tapestry of human character on steroids. It just is intensified by 1,000 times, and to not see those going through this right now, as especially sort of the victims of it, as so other than us. So I think just those moments of, if your calling is sort of in the bridge building weaving business, I don't think that's philanthropy, but it's a form of trying to highlight that there is some mysterious interconnectedness, and there's certainly a portrait to learn from in our own, and be inspired by, I think, in our own challenges.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I say it is philanthropy, the love of humankind. And just such a privilege to hear from both of you. I suspect that we could stay in this room an hour more, but really want to express my deep gratitude, my deep appreciation for the time that you have given, for the depth of this conversation, for the opportunity to reflect together as a community, representing Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. It is nearly 8 o'clock. I do not want to keep us too long, but truly value the time that you have taken, the opportunity to learn with and from you. Will you join me in thanking David and Damon?
That's so nice. Thank you. Thank you. That's really gracious. Thank you.